Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
I'm Kevin Schofield. I'm here to introduce and welcome Larry Downs, who's visiting us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Larry is here today to discuss the laws of disruption, harnessing the new forces that govern life and business in the digital age. In the laws of disruption, Larry Downs revisits the internet revolution and explains a growing chasm between the forces of change and the businesses and bureaucracies that try with increasing futility to regulate them. He explores 9 critical areas in which technology is dramatically rewriting the rules of business and life. The laws of disruption hopes to help business owners and managers understand not only how to avoid being blindsided by customer rebellion, but also sometimes how to benefit from it. It suggests to lawyers, judges, and regulators when to keep their hands off the system, and to consumers the consequences of their digital actions. Larry has worked for over 3 decades at the intersection of innovation and business. He's played leadership roles at some of the biggest consulting firms in the world and held faculty appointments in both business and law schools, including Northwestern University and UC Berkeley. His earlier book, Unleashing the Killer App, has sold over 200,000 copies and was recently named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the 5 most important books ever written on business and technology. Downs is a partner with the Bell Mason Group and a fellow at the Stanford Law School Center for Internet and Society. Please join me in welcoming Larry Downs to Microsoft to discuss the laws of disruption, harnessing the new forces that govern life and business in the digital age. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here today to talk about my new book, which in fact officially went on sale today, as it turns out. Let me start by asking a question. How many of you are watching the new ABC show Flash Forward? Okay, it's about half of you. So for those of you who aren't watching it, it's a very interesting show. It starts out, everybody in the world blacks out for 2 minutes and 17 seconds. And during that time, everybody has a vision of what it is they're going to be doing 6 months in the future. So when they wake up, there's an FBI agent. He's the sort of the star of the show. And what his vision was that he saw himself figuring out what had caused the blackout in the first place. And so the first thing he tries to do is to put up on a wall all the clues that he saw during his vision. And then in the course of the series, now he's sort of going through trying to figure out, well, what do those clues actually mean? And I thought that's a really good way to tell a story. I'm going to start with the end. Doesn't make any sense, but then you're going to work your way forward and try and see if, as you go forward, the clues start to fall into place. So I'm going to do that with you today. I'm going to start by putting up a clue wall here and tell you essentially the conclusions of this talk. They shouldn't make a whole lot of sense now, but maybe as we're going through it, you'll think back to, oh, now I see what that was when he talked about it before. So I'm going to tell you 4 things. These are essentially the 4 punchlines of this presentation. They may not make sense now, but let's hope they do by the end. So first of all, number 1 is, for better or worse, law and regulation have become key drivers of business in the 21st century. There's no way to avoid the fact, I'm sure that I don't have to hammer that point home too hard with you guys because you experience this every day. Now the problem is this is particularly the case in industries that are being transformed by information technology. Because of some of the unique nature of information, it gets to be even uglier, as we're going to see. Okay? Number 2, the existing legal system, as we'll see, is completely obsolete, doesn't fit, doesn't work particularly well with innovation, doesn't help in this transformation, and yet despite the fact that it's clunky, it's broken, it's expensive, and it's inefficient, we have absolutely no choice but to continue to engage with it. Right? We can't just say, you know, your lawsuit doesn't make any sense to me, so I'm not going to bother to respond. Unfortunately, things don't work that way. The problem, however, is that you can't just engage the old legal system. In fact, you can't rely on it to help you, make your strategic goals. Now, that may be a workable solution in the short term. So if you're a patent troll and that's working for you now, that may be well and good, but it's not a long-term solution. Because what we're going to see is that old legal system is breaking down, it's falling apart, it's going to be replaced. And so at the same time that you're engaging with the old obsolete system, you also need to be spending, let's say equal amounts of time thinking about the emerging legal system that's going to replace it. And in fact, doing what you can to help shape that and give it the kind of spin that you want. Okay, so one of the consequences of number 1 and 2 put together is that the nature of the relationship between legal counsel, and I mean by this, inside legal counsel, government affairs, outside legal counsel, and the rest of the business has to change dramatically. Think back, say, to 1997, 1998 or so. If you were working then, and you can imagine what was the role of the chief information officer in those days. Very rarely, in very few organizations, did the chief information officer have what you might think of as a strategic role. They didn't participate in strategic planning. They didn't really participate with much of the executive team in terms of forming product or service strategy. They were really in more or less a support function. And of course, 10 years ago, what happened? Well, what happened obviously was the internet became a strategic part of the business, and as a result, the CIO's office had to transform itself to become part of the strategy of the company. That's a good, in fact, that's a good starting point to think about what is the future role for legal counsel. A very similar transformation is going underway right now, and for very much the same reason. It's just 10 years later. Okay. And then number 4, well, if strategy has become, if law and regulation have become strategic, obviously we need a new kind of strategic plan in order to deal with them in a much more integrated way rather than in the kind of responsive way that most of us have been doing it up till now. Okay, so let me tell you how I got started on this journey. We'll go all the way back now. One of the things that I noticed, especially over the last couple of years, was that increasingly, as you're reading stories about technology, and I'm talking here about the mainstream media, I'm not talking about legal journals. In the mainstream media, technology stories increasingly are becoming legal stories. One day, a couple weeks ago, I noticed that every headline in the New York Times technology section was about a lawsuit, about some regulatory activity, some lobbying going on or something. They're all law stories. And this seemed very strange. And of course, most of them are bad law stories. Right? There's stories about, let's say, massive copyright theft, the loss of personal privacy, some bad new law that somebody's trying to get passed, or as often the case is some kind of new litigation that's being started by a competitor as a way of gaining some kind of competitive leverage either over another company or sometimes even over customers or over suppliers. So that's the bottom line with most of these stories. And I started to think, well, why is this happening? And indeed, as I started clipping them and putting them aside, one of the things I realized was they're happening more frequently all the time. There's something very clear going on here, and it's getting more serious. And of course, the numbers get bigger, right? So the size of the fines, the size of the verdicts get bigger. The sort of life or death nature of some of these cases. If you're, say, Research in Motion, if you remember a couple of years ago when they lost a patent dispute and nearly had to shut down the BlackBerry network, those kinds of life or death things were getting more frequent as well. That was the first thing that happened. And the second thing was, I sort of think of as the aha moment for this book. Some of you may remember, about a year ago, there was a revolt on Facebook. And this had to do with a change that Facebook wanted to make to the Terms of Service Agreement. So you all know what Terms of Service Agreement are, right? Those are those very complicated documents on websites or come with software products. They're intentionally written in very, very dense legal terminology so that they can't be read, and most of us don't read them. But of course, this is Facebook, and some of their members did read the changes that they made, and they rightly or wrongly came to the conclusion that these proposed changes were going to essentially give Facebook complete ownership of all the private data of the users. And so this being Facebook, what did they do? Well, they formed a Facebook group called Facebook Users Against the Terms of Service Changes. And within a couple hours, there were 100,000 members of that Facebook group. And this led to some very embarrassing headlines. Obviously, within a couple days, the company had to reverse course. They withdrew the proposed changes. And even more dramatically, a few days after that, the CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, announced that they were going to make a fundamental change in the way they even thought about the Terms of Service Agreement. And what they said was, perhaps in not the most artful way, but they realized was that the Terms of Service Agreement really was kind of the governing document for a community. And of course, in the case of Facebook, we're talking about, a couple of 100 million people. So it's a fairly significant sized place. And they said, look, this is the governing document. Maybe it ought to be developed in a somewhat more democratic fashion. And so what they announced was that from this point forward, all terms of service changes, first of all, that was going to be written in plain English language, not in legalese. It would be done essentially on the open source model in collaboration with the users as well as the company and its legal counsel. Well, this is really quite a revolutionary statement. Now, first of all, you can understand why they had to do this. If you think about Facebook, any social media company, their entire value is really nothing more than the content provided by the users. And if they, annoy the users enough, they'll just pick up and move to some other place, right? They'll go to MySpace, they'll go to LinkedIn, they'll go somewhere else. So clearly, appeasing the users is important. But I think something even more fundamental is happening here, especially if you put these two little clues together. So what we see with all the stories I've been clipping is that the old legal system increasingly is rubbing up against innovation, particularly innovation having to do with information technology. It's breaking down more all the time. And here, in the Facebook example, we get some glimmer of what might be coming along instead. Right? So you can think of this as the very first moments of some new kind of governing mechanism for the way in which we exist when we're online. And that's the moment where I thought, okay, now I understand what's going on here. So this is now, let's say, 10 years more or less after the internet revolution. What's happened is that the environment in which we communicate with each other online has become robust enough that many people start to think of it as a second existence. Or if you're familiar with the virtual world Second Life, that's a good metaphor for what's happening. It's becoming not just about business, not about transforming business anymore. It's really becoming more about how you live, how you interact, how you communicate, how you entertain yourself, how you develop relationships with friends and family and so on. And as it's become more of a real place, the need for some new form of governance has become increasingly important. And I think of this sort of new relationship or this new existence as what I call digital life. And I know a little bit something about digital life. As Kevin mentioned, I wrote a book some years ago, now 10 years ago in fact, called Unleashing the Killer App. It made the prediction, which I have to admit was neither original nor particularly difficult to make, but it made the prediction that what was happening, this is 1998, was that the internet was going to transform the way in which business would be done in a very profound way. And couldn't exactly say the speed or exactly the direction everything was going to take, but you get a pretty good idea of how the internet was going to change the way things were going to get done. And the book, again, largely I think owing to good timing, turned out to be very successful and really helped me to get access now to the kinds of new information sources that help me to piece together new pieces of this puzzle going forward. And so one of the sort of key moments, I guess, in Unleashing the Killer App was what I referred to as the law of disruption. And I said, this is why things are going to get messy. You can say, for example, that the way in which human beings and the sort of systems that human beings operate under, or our economic systems, our legal systems, our social systems, they change pretty much at an incremental pace. That's what we're comfortable with. That's the way we evolve, if you will. We like to change incrementally. But what information technology was doing was changing exponentially. And I'll come back and say why in a minute, although I'm sure you all know. And what I said was that in this gap, this increasingly large gap between the potential for change of technology and the actual pace of change with which human beings were comfortable, there was the possibility for increasing amounts of disruption. And I called the disruptive elements in there, what we called them, the killer apps. And we said, this is good news for people who have the ability to exploit those changes a little bit faster than everybody else. That's all you have to do, just be a little bit faster. And you are able to take advantage of them. On the other hand, the people down below who aren't making the change quickly, they're going to be the victims. And that's, of course, the story, I think, of the last 10 years. And to put it in words, which, by the way, sound very scientific but are based on absolutely nothing other than empirical evidence, we said that the law of disruption was technology changes exponentially, but social, economic, and legal systems change incrementally. Right? And that was, that's where we were, as I say, 10 years ago. Now, I know that for this particular audience, this is going to be old news, but I still want to say a little bit more about the exponential change, just because I want to try and make it a little bit more concrete for you and help you understand that even though it's been going on for a long time, particularly over the last decade, it's still going on. And the disruptive potential gets more and more interesting, bigger opportunities, also bigger threats as we go along. So, right, so you all understand the two main drivers of digital life, Moore's Law and Metcalfe's Law. Moore's Law, every 12 to 18 months, processing power doubles, price holds constant. Metcalfe's Law, Robert Metcalfe's observation that the value of any network technology is a square of the number of people using it. Yeah?
Metcalfe's Law has been much discredited. I mean, most, for example, social networks, when people in Africa join, most people here just don't notice or much care unless they have relatives or friends there.
Right. Well, so the question is, does Metcalfe's Law really hold? So Moore's Law holds. I think we're pretty comfortable with that. We don't know how much longer it'll hold, but it's certainly holding. Metcalfe's Law, I wouldn't say it's been discredited, but certainly there's been a lot of caveats and extensions to it. In some senses, for example, David Reed has argued pretty forcefully that it's not strong enough. Because, in fact, this only applies if the network is a one-to-one network. If you can form multiple connections, this is sort of a telephone network of one call to one call, that's where you get the squaring function. But if you're actually making multiple connections, let's say a conference call, or in the case of a social networking site where you're connecting multiply to multiply, in fact, the curve could go up much higher. At the same time, of course, there's always, only so much attention that can be paid to any technology at any given moment. And so, in fact, there's sort of a leveling off point as well. So, yes, it may be going up higher, but it may also be leveling off. But certainly, we understand that network technologies have these network effects. That hasn't been discredited. And even with the social networking sites, no matter how inefficient the connections are, clearly getting from 0 to 200 million users in a short amount of time, in the case of Facebook, suggests that network effects still have a pretty powerful kind of gravity that they exert. Right. So those two operating together, we understand them. They're interesting in theory, but I wanted to make them a little bit more concrete. Now, the way to do this is, as I say, let's start with 1955 and call that the beginning of the information technology revolution. So this is the UNIVAC 1. I pick it because it's the first computer that was sold for commercial purposes. GE bought one in 1955 for a payroll application. That was really the first commercial use of computing technology. And if you said that a UNIVAC was a 1, it's sort of just an absolute value, here's what happens, particularly as you apply Moore's Law, when you double a very small number, 1 goes to 2, 2 goes to 4. At the beginning, it's not very interesting, but as you continue to double it for a long period of time, very quickly that small number becomes an enormous number, and each successive doubling becomes even more interesting and that much more disruptive. So let's turn Moore's Law forward and say we're up to now, 45 years later, to the year 2000. The PlayStation 2, which was in fact a toy, at least on design for 8 to 13-year-old boys, but we know who really uses it. That, if you sort of just took raw processing power, which I know is not a particularly effective measurement, but it's fine for these purposes, you could say that a PlayStation 2 had the equivalent processing power of 22 million UNIVAC 1s. Right? So from 1955 to 2000, you got up from 1 to 22 million UNIVAC 1s. And in fact, just to make you clear what that means is if you had to take 22 million UNIVAC 1s, sort of put them all in one place, then you can't stack them, but just sort of lay them end to end, to actually store them in the first place, you would need a space about the size of Seattle. And if you wanted to buy them in 1955, you would need an amount of money that's roughly the GDP of the United States this year. Right. So that's what happens when you double a small number. And then, as I said, once you get to these big numbers, then the doublings get even more interesting. So let's just move forward 5 more years and get the PlayStation 3. Well, that's 660 million UNIVACs. And to store those, you would need about the entire state of Washington and amount of money that's greater than the total monetary supply in the world today. That's disruption. It has, as I say, it hasn't stopped. It's only accelerated, and it will only continue to accelerate. And that's why, as I say, I think that's why the moment has now come. So, we all understand that in the last 10 years, business has changed pretty fundamentally, and we got a pretty good sense of the trajectory of that change. But now, as my Facebook example suggests, and as those other stories I clipped suggest, the next system that's really about to go through its dramatic transformation is law and regulation. That's what all these conflicts really signal to me, and why they continue to accelerate. As the introduction of disruptive technology accelerates, the number of conflicts is going to accelerate with them. And the problem is, it's very difficult to understand when you're going through one of these transformations where it's going to happen and how quickly it's going to happen. Because even, no matter how clear we are on what's going on, our ability to see the future is always very limited by our own appreciation of what the present is today. Or as the literary critic Frederick Jameson once said, science fiction is really just a kind of nostalgia for the present. It's really just our way of looking at the future, but always through the eyes of what we see today. Or as the Nobel Prize-winning economist Ronald Coase likes to say, if you torture the data long enough, nature will always confess. And that makes it very difficult to predict. Of course, my goal is to try and predict as well as I can how that legal change is going to happen and what businesses can do both to survive it and exploit it as the process goes on. And I have to show you, I can't resist the temptation to show you a very short little video montage that I put together that helps explain why it's so difficult to predict the future, even as you're living in the midst of the biggest transformation, even if you are, in fact, yourself the source of a lot of that transformation. It's very difficult to see. So this is a very short clip. Actually, if you're interested, there's a longer version of this with more clips and longer clips on my website. But just take a look at a couple of these examples.
Imagine, if you will, sitting down to your morning coffee, turning on your home computer to read the day's newspaper. Well, it's not as far-fetched as it may seem. In fact, both local San Francisco papers are investing a lot of money to try and get a service just like that started. Science editor Steve Newman reports on one person already using the brand new system.
17 stories up in his fashionable North Beach apartment, Richard Halloran is calling a local number that will connect him with a computer in Columbus, Ohio. Meanwhile, across town, in this less than fashionable cubbyhole at the San Francisco Examiner, these editors are programming today's copy of the paper into that same Ohio computer. When the telephone connection between these two terminals is made, the newest form of electronic journalism lights up Mr. Halloran's television with just about everything the Examiner prints in its regular edition. That is, with the exception of pictures, ads, and the comics. 8 newspapers around the country are currently in the computer network, and within the next few weeks, 3 others will join in.
This is an experiment. We're trying to figure out what it's going to mean to us as editors and reporters and what it means to the home user. And we're not in it to make money. We're probably not going to lose a lot, but we aren't going to make much either.
Well, it takes over 2 hours to receive the entire text of the newspaper over the phone, and with an hourly use charge of $5, the new telepaper won't be much competition for the 20-cent street edition.
Do you have ice hockey by Activision? Think you're ready for it? One of the roughest video games around for your Atari game system? Ready to battle for the puck? Well... To inflict fierce body checking? Yeah. Furious stick checking? Yeah. Ruthless tripping? You really think you're ready for all that? I'm ready! Fine. Cash your charge. Ice hockey by Activision!
Finding a phone in a car isn't that unusual anymore, except when it leaves the car for greener pastures, the high seas, or a leisurely lunch. Radio Shack keeps you in constant communication with their affordable, transportable cellular telephone.
Hello? Oh, yes, he's right here. It's for you.
Yes, I heard about the merger. Buy 100 shares.
The affordable, transportable cellular telephone, only at Radio Shack.
The Sony Betamax. Its only purpose is to serve you. This totally new concept in home entertainment will expand your enjoyment of television viewing to a level that was, a short time ago, nothing more than an ambitious dream. With the Betamax at your command, you'll never again be deprived of watching whatever program you desire at your convenience. You'll be free of the restrictions of time. Its uses are defined only by the limits of your imagination.
Okay, so that's the problem, right? No matter how visionary you think you are, you're really seeing the future through the lens of the past, or indeed, at very best, the present. So one of the things I've tried to do is figure out if there was a better way to predict how this legal transformation was going to happen. And I thought really a good idea was to go back and look at a previous generation of legal transformation and try to see if there was any lesson to be learned from that. So the last great version of this transformation, again driven by disruptive technology, happened in the 19th century with essentially the Industrial Revolution. And of course the sort of the equivalent of the semiconductor then was the steam engine, and the kind of, one of the leading killer apps of that period was the railroad. And if you look at the railroad, it had very many similar features to how the internet has progressed over the last 10 years. It changed the sense of time, of distance. It made possible new kinds of relationships, new kinds of businesses, new products and services that simply weren't possible until it became established as an infrastructure. At the same time, however, in fact, you get a sense of it from looking at this picture, the railroads concentrated that new wealth in the hands of a very few organizations, large railroad trusts, that controlled a lot of the transcontinental traffic in the United States. And as a result of that, there was a considerable amount of economic hardship placed on certain groups of users, certain groups of shippers who happened to live between the Mississippi and the Pacific Ocean, where there were only a few possible railroads in which to deal. And there was a considerable amount of political unrest, not unlike the kind of unrest we see today, with people complaining about copyright and privacy and identity theft. In this case, the progressive movement was able to convince President Roosevelt in particular, that without breaking up the trusts, without taking away some of the excessive economic leverage of those large companies, the possibility was that there would very likely be violent revolution in the United States. And in fact, of course, that's exactly how the same story played out elsewhere, and certainly in Russia and the Soviet Union. And that difference between how the US and how Russia responded to this economic change really kind of gave us the sense of what history was going to be like, or set up the main conflicts for the next 100 years. Well, my great legal hero in this story is a man named Brooks Adams. And Brooks Adams was the great-grandson of John Adams, so he had a pretty good understanding of what it meant to have a tyrannical rule, whether by an absent king or by a nameless railroad corporation. And Adams, who was a very principal advisor to Theodore Roosevelt during this progressive period, understood that legal change was going to be sort of the last stage of any great technological revolution. And in this particular case, actually, Adams, who was lawyer for the city of Spokane, the Adams family owned a great deal of property there, and people in Spokane who wanted to ship goods or receive goods over the railroads only had the Great Northern Railroad to use. And as a result of that, the Great Northern extracted excessive profit from those shippers, which they used to offset the markets where they had to compete, say in Chicago and also on the coast as well. So in his brief to the Interstate Commerce Commission, Adams wrote this statement, which I think of as the best summary I can think of, even still 100 years later, for why law is the last thing to change in this transformation, but why, in fact, it's going to change. Let me just read it to you. He says, "There's no ancient and abstract principle of right and wrong which can safely be deduced as a guide to regulate the relations of railways and monopolies among our people, because railways and monopolies are products of forces unknown in former times. The character of competition has changed, and the law must change to meet it or collapse. Such is my general theory." Now, in fact, the law did collapse. Adams knew that it would collapse. Really, the only question for him, and ultimately for Roosevelt, was, is it going to collapse violently, or is it going to collapse in a more orderly fashion? So just to kind of bring this back, the parallels, I think, are pretty straightforward. If you think of the industrial era, its killer app was the steam engine, and ultimately what the steam engine did was to replace the feudal system of law that had been in place for about 1,000 years with a system of law that was based on personal property and markets to allow for the exchange of that property in a free and open manner. If, in fact, now we're entering the next great technological revolution, the information revolution, where the semiconductor is the sort of driving killer app, then here we're talking about the replacement of the property system with one that's more native and based on the sort of unique physical and economic characteristics of information as an economic good. So we'll call it for the moment kind of the law of collaboration. And what is that going to look like? Well, that's where we come to the book. Now, what I tried to do in the book is to kind of summarize the 9 areas where I think this transformation is going on most clearly, and try to paint a picture of what I think will happen and how it will happen and what you need to do to be as well prepared for it, as well as to survive what happens in the interim as possible. But you already know this, right? These are the sort of things that you come across, not on a daily basis, certainly on a regular basis. These are the kinds of issues that interfere, frankly, with the way in which you develop and release products, and if they were resolved quickly, would make for a better environment in terms of how you develop and how you work. But they're all over the place, and this is only just a short list. I organized these, what I call these laws of disruption, along these 3 main bodies, what I call the private law, what I call public law, and then information law. And they organize themselves around these basic areas in which people are leading these more robust digital life. Now, I am basing my recommendations on entirely my sense of how the best, most efficient economic use of information takes place, and as a result of which it puts me sometimes in a very interesting position. So the sort of the most extreme people in this revolution think that I'm way too conservative. The more conservative people think I'm way too extreme. In fact, the book was reviewed this morning in the Wall Street Journal, and I was delighted to see that the journal in the same paragraph said that my point of view was both libertarian and socialist at the same time. And you can imagine which one they thought was good and which one they thought was bad. But certainly if you're operating under a sort of principled approach, you're going to go where it leads you. And in this case, in some cases it says, what I think of as the right answer looks like a libertarian, and in some cases it looks like a socialist response. Now, I'm going to not go through any of these in detail. I thought I would leave that for the question time. And really what I want to do is circle back to my clue wall from Flash Forward and just take one small but I think very important tangent to talk about how all of this happens, or the process of all 9 of those transformations. One of the most important things that I think companies badly underestimate is what you might think of as the irrational response to disruptive technology. So again, as that gap gets wider, right, as the difference between our ability to adapt with the potential of technology to change gets wider, the potential for unusual, or what you might think of as irrational response, gets bigger all the time. Now that's not unique to the current generation of technology, right? So back again in the industrial era, there was a group of people, the followers of Ned Ludd, who we now refer to as the Luddites, and these were farmers who actually, believed that these machines for picking and weaving textiles, which could do it so much more efficiently and so much more quickly than they could, must be possessed by evil spirits. And in part to rid themselves of those spirits, and in part to try and preserve a way of life that was clearly on its way out, they actually went around north of England just busting up the machines and trying to destroy the disruptive technology. And actually it turns out that in fact that kind of response is much older than just the 19th century. So in this extremely important but very difficult to read book by Eric Davis, Technosis, he traces the relationship between mysticism and technology all the way back to the ancient Greeks and brings it pretty much right up until the beginning of the internet age. And his observation, which I'll sort of boil down very unfairly, is that the response to disruptive technology initially is always that it's some kind of magic. Most people eventually get over that as they learn it and they understand it and they absorb it, but some people never do. And certainly in the course of that transformation, you will encounter mystical thinking. And in fact, you yourself, I'm sure, experience it. Right? There's every time some new technology. I was having dinner with a former student last night who works at Microsoft, and he was telling me about a new Picasa application which will take photos and take the face and then sort of crunch the numbers down and use that to try and match the face to other photos in its vast library. Right? And you think, your first reaction to that is, yuck! Right? And this is the visceral reaction that everybody has, particularly as technologies get closer and closer to doing things that affect our sense of who we are and what we are in the world. We're just going to always have a visceral reaction to it. It's usually one that we get over, but in the interim, some strange things can happen. So for example, just pick one that's going on right now. A lot of you are probably familiar with developments in RFID technology, and it's almost at this point, the price point is nearly there to replace the sort of static barcodes on product packaging with active RFID tags that will have a minimal ability to send and receive data. And in fact, they're so small, the chips themselves are so small that essentially they can be powered in most cases just by static electricity. So it's a remarkable technology. It has great potential. It has the potential certainly to transform the entire manufacturing, distribution, retailing supply chain in very interesting ways by collecting data and being able to figure out where things need to be as opposed to where they are, what kinds of products are out of stock or need to be in service, theft control. There's all sorts of applications for this technology. Again, we don't know what they are because we can't see them except through that lens of the present. But we know this is very interesting and has a great deal of potential. And if you've never heard of this before just now, you probably just had that visceral reaction immediately as I told you about it and said, what do you mean? All the stuff that I own is going to be communicating, back to the manufacturer 24 hours a day about what it's doing or where it is. That's kind of creepy. And not surprisingly, the privacy advocates are having a field day with RFID. In particular, a group called Caspian, which is named after the character in the Chronicles of Narnia. This is a group that believes that, in fact, this is the worst technology ever to be invented, and in some sense it's going to ruin whatever's left of our private lives. Well, it turns out that the person behind Caspian, in some sense perhaps the only person really involved, is a woman named Catherine Albrecht, who's extremely energetic and very good with the press. Really good at the soundbite, so she'll say things like, RFID technology is, poses the kind of risk to humanity of nuclear weapons. It's going to bring about George Orwell's 1984, and so on and so forth. And I have to say, a lot of this, the boycotts and the protests that she organizes take place before the tests have even started. And really, the technology is nowhere near ready for wide-scale deployment. And so many of the companies that are the targets of her abuse never see it coming and respond very poorly, always, again, after the fact instead of ahead of time. And I think probably one of the principal reasons they can't understand the ferocity of her objection to this is they don't really believe, even if they know it, where her objection originates from. As it turns out, she explains this in a book she wrote called The Spy Chips Threat, Why Christians Should Resist RFID and Electronic Surveillance, is that Albrecht believes that RFID technology is literally the technology prophesied in the book of Revelations that the Antichrist would use to control commerce as part of the end of days. Right? And there's certainly text in the book of Revelations. It doesn't say RFID. Obviously, you can argue with her biblical interpretation, but nonetheless, that is the origin of her objection to RFID technology. Now, I have to say that she is by no means the only person who takes such an extreme view of new technology, and it's not, in any case, the most radical view of new technology. The point is that there will be more and more people like this and more reactions like this as that curve continues to move further and further away from what we can adapt to and what the technology makes possible. So what do you have to do about that? Well, there are certainly ways to deal with this effectively, right? I mean, you can deal with mystical thinking. It takes patience, it takes public education, and it takes, in some sense, a little bit of magical thinking on your own part. And again, to understand the source of it as being non-rational if you're going to form a strategic response. So in some sense, what I'm saying is, we now all need kind of a chief mystical officer in our companies to help us predict what kinds of non-rational responses we're going to have, because even though it may seem funny, it may seem bizarre, it can be incredibly disruptive to the process. Right? She has set back the RFID industry by a good 10 years, either through lobbying, so she goes to the FTC, she goes to Congress, she has gotten laws passed in California against these tags before they've even been deployed. The old legal system, which, as I said, we have to continue to engage with it, even as it's falling apart, it is a chief weapon of people who are trying to resist change. They will file the most annoying lawsuits. They will get the worst laws passed. They will get consumers riled up, in bad ways and get them to do things that ultimately they don't want to do. So if we don't respond, that's what's going to happen. Yeah?
What's their motivation? Is it because they actually believe what they're saying, or is there some other purpose, market-driven purpose that they're shooting?
Well, I don't know what's inside her head. But I'd say you can, for purposes of this discussion, you should believe that this is genuinely what she believes. That this is her honest motivation, is that she does not want the apocalypse to come. And that if we roll out this technology, it will. And if she doesn't believe that, she's certainly tapping into a vein of that in sort of, American paranoid thinking that is not hard to tap into. All right. So if we can be responsive to this sort of thing, one way to think of it is we would like to have the ability, all of us, to have our own sort of ability to see into the future by 6 months, and hopefully do so without the blackouts. Thanks. So I thought that was a good place to stop. As I said, I didn't go through any of the 9 areas in any detail. I thought we could talk about whichever ones you're interested in, and just if it makes it easier, I've sort of listed here some of the hot topics in regulation of innovation, and I've kind of, it's maybe a little hard to see, but I've kind of given you my thumbs up or thumbs down to let you know how I feel about it. But I thought that would be a good starting place as any to talk about some of the substantive areas. Yeah?
Actually, I'm interested on your perspective for the immunity for service providers. Are you talking about the recent immunity in terms of cooperation with government and surveillance?
Oh, okay. So the question is about the immunity for service providers. So there's a couple versions of this. One of the things that was very controversial last year was as part of the renewal of the Patriot Act and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and some of the other things, immunity was given to technology companies and infrastructure companies that had cooperated, probably illegally, with the NSA in particular before the law was revised. I don't think, so the short answer is I don't think immunity for them was right, but that's not the immunity I'm talking about here. Here I'm talking about a much more important immunity, which is only in the United States. If you are the publisher of a website or any kind of interactive service, it's very broad. You run a blog, you run a social networking site, you have a website where people can post comments. Under U.S. law, you are immune from lawsuits over the content of what people post. So if I run a message board and somebody writes something that turns out to be defamatory or turns out to be in violation of some other law, the poster can be sued for their contents, of course, but I can't as the provider. And that's a law that, as I say, the U.S. has it, the rest of the world does not. And my thesis is that that's probably the wisest decision Congress has ever made when it comes to the Internet. This was a law passed very early on. It was part of the 1996 Communication Act. It's known as Section 230, immunity. And I think one of the reasons why social networking and all the things have as much of a U.S. focus as they do is because they have this protection, whereas, particularly in Europe and particularly the UK, that protection doesn't exist. I mention this because there was a case in California last year where the Federal Court of Appeals denied immunity to a company called roommates.com. So roommates.com runs a website, I should say, still does, to help people find roommates. And they were sued by fair housing advocate groups in Southern California that said, some of the questions they asked in terms of how you set up your profile violated anti-discrimination laws, because it said, it asked you what your sex was, if you were, if you wanted a roommate with or without children, or if you wanted a male roommate or a female roommate, or so on. And the Court of Appeals, in a very poor decision, said, well, because of the way in which the website is structured, we're not going to extend immunity to the website because they actually asked the questions and they gave you a drop-down menu with the choices. So in some ways, they were writing the bad content themselves, not just letting you write it. And this contrasts with a case in Chicago over similar lawsuit against Craigslist for the exact same kind of listings. The Chicago Court of Appeals said, oh, Craigslist is immune because all they do is just give you a blank page and you write down whatever you want, including, I hate people of color. You could put whatever you wanted. But since Craigslist wasn't giving you any kind of structure, then they still got the immunity, whereas roommates.com, which gave you the structure to make it easier to do searches, they don't get the immunity. And that was, as I say, it's been very badly criticized in legal circles. But the court, really went out of its way in that case to say, we think the Internet is mature now. It's not a fragile thing that can be smothered in the womb. I think those are the exact words of the judge. So we think it has to kind of comply with the same kinds of regulations as brick and mortar companies doing the exact same thing that they're doing virtually. And what I say in the book is whether or not that's true, and I don't think it is, But it's a very bad trend if the judges are deciding when it's time to rewrite the law, regardless of whether or not it's a good idea to rewrite it in the first place. So that's what I was talking about for immunity. Yeah, Mike.
So, you know, people use our software in general to store enormous amounts of valuable business information, but our licenses, like all software licenses, basically say, hey, we're not responsible for any problems that come. Like if you lose all your payroll records because of some bug in the database, not our problem.
Right.
As we move more to cloud computing, where that data is going to be stored on servers that are actually managed by us and Google and Yahoo and other large companies, what do you think will happen with that kind of a provision of law where, hey, if the data all goes away, you know, not our problem, we can refund, you know, your service charge?
Yeah. Well, so there's really two basic kinds of users involved in that scenario you just painted, and I think the answer is different depending on which kind we're talking about. So we're talking about large corporate users. Well, guess what? They're going to negotiate, they already do, their own license agreement, which either does or doesn't give you, you know, liability, or under what conditions it does or doesn't give you liability. And those, as I say, that's nothing new. That's the way it works now. Now, for consumers, it's a very different picture, right? They have no bargaining position, although the Facebook story suggests, well, maybe under certain circumstances now they do have some bargaining position. But up till now, they have had none. You just, you know, you feed them. And in fact, the legal term for it is a contract of adhesion. It's a take it or leave it contract. There's no even hint that there's going to be any negotiations for it. What happens is, so this goes back to the railroads, right? If you only have one railroad to deal with, if you're the city of Spokane and the only railroad you've got is the Great Northern, and they tell you that you have to pay twice as much to ship your goods as someone in Chicago, even though they're shipping it further, because you would compete with other railroads in Chicago, but you don't compete in Spokane, well, it's take it or leave it. But ultimately, if they are repressed enough, they're going to revolt. And again, the revolt can be either violent or nonviolent, depending on what kind of support they get. So there's been a movement now for at least 15 years to essentially create a consumer bill of rights for software licenses and for things like warranties and liability. And in fact, ironically enough, I mean, there was a draft law written called UCITA, the Uniform Commercial and Information Transaction Act. And the reason that it didn't go anywhere was because it was perceived by consumer groups as being too favorable to software companies. That it said, you know, you could declaim all warranties, you know, you could, you know, it was, you know, it wasn't really much different than most consumer laws now for physical goods, but it got killed because, and the ironic reason I say it's ironic is because in the absence of UCITA, most end-user license agreements or terms of service agreements are far more repressive than what UCITA would have actually allowed. You know, they won the battle, they lost the war. That's certainly where things stand now. And as you say, as things are moving more in the cloud, and more importantly, as more valuable data gets moved to the cloud, then I think it's more likely the Facebook scenario becomes, as I say, that's the beginning of something that could be messy, or if it's managed well, it could be a way of actually getting competitive advantage. You say, okay, fine, we are the company that gives you a slightly better terms of service than the other folks. You know, it's very, you know, especially if you're the main provider of something, self-insurance is not really all that expensive of a proposition. So in fact, you say, fine, if something goes wrong, we will cover it to a certain extent. In fact, you can do that. It looks very generous, but in fact, it can be done very cheaply economically. Yes, sir.
So one of the things I've noticed here is you're very U.S. focused, but nowadays, you know, Microsoft, for example, I think sells more software outside the country than inside. So I'm sort of curious how you see this affecting in terms of multinational companies and getting close to 200 countries around the world with their own laws.
Okay, so the question is about outside the U.S. How is this, and particularly as business gets global, who cares what, you know, country it is? So I do talk a fair amount in the book about, particularly about European law, which is, you know, I'm comfortable with. Outside of that, I get pretty uncomfortable. So I try to stay away from it. And frankly, there are very significant differences between the U.S. and Europe on a couple of main things, privacy being one of them. The privacy laws in Europe are much more, you would think of as, I suppose, pro-consumer or pro-privacy, in that they give the right to information initially to whoever the information is about, whereas the default rule in the U.S. is whoever collected the information is the owner of the information. In actual practice, at least so far, that difference doesn't turn out to make much difference, because in Europe all you do is say, you want to give us information, waive all your privacy rights in Europe, otherwise we won't take it in the first place. And so it hasn't really had much effect. The other main place that there's a difference between U.S. and Europe is in antitrust, which obviously is, and my leading example for all of those is Microsoft. It's ironic because on paper the antitrust law has developed almost identically. So if you read, the statutes, and if you looked at the theory behind antitrust, there's no real significant difference between U.S. and Europe. What's different is how it's being enforced. And clearly, I think, and I can say this because I don't work for Microsoft, clearly the Europeans have it in for you. And they have it in for you not because, this is going back to kind of Theodore Roosevelt-style antitrust enforcement. It's not based on the economic model of, all right, we're actually going to look at the markets, we're actually going to look at behavior and see, if the market is failing. That's the basis on which antitrust is supposed to be invoked. In fact, in Europe, it's entirely political, and it's based on the desire to protect European products, European development, and in the case of open source in terms of Linux, something that's not U.S. So it does make a big difference. It shouldn't, but it does. And even, I think, worse is the idea that it's not even just about U.S. versus Europe. In fact, you're going to be offering, or you offer a global product, and you find that it's being subjected to, incredibly local regulation. We're not talking about national, even continental stuff. You get a letter from the mosquito abatement district of Contra Costa County saying, oh, well, we just passed a law that says software is now taxed, or we have certain moral concerns about social networking sites. So within the state of, and I'll give you a real example, where was it? Within the state of Pennsylvania, social networking sites can't talk about child pornography. They can't, and we will scour the net and decide what is child pornography, and any website in the world has to comply with the sort of local regulation of the state of Pennsylvania, administered by 3 off-duty police officers scanning the net looking for things that they don't like. And this is bad law, this is bad enforcement, and incredibly dangerous. So what I try to propose as much as possible is the development of totally global standards. How this new legal regime emerges, it only makes sense, it's only going to work if it's a uniform global standard. Because digital life does not occur in just one country or just one mosquito abatement district, right? It's nowhere and everywhere at the same time. And one of the biggest problems now is, I think it may even be on there somewhere, is preemption of local enforcement. One of the nice things about a lot of federal laws in the U.S. is that whether or not they do a particularly good job, let's say, of stopping spam. So there's a law on the books in the U.S., the CAN Spam Act, which has been very ineffective. But one of the ways in which it's been effective is it says this law preempts any state law about spam. So you don't have to deal with 50 different versions of, in some ways, perhaps 50 very different versions of the same piece of legislation. That's a good start, right? We need to move it up at least, a couple of levels so that we're only talking about one globally preemptive set of regulations. But it's definitely a serious problem for all technology providers. Yeah, in the back.
I'm curious about how you think that maps to the area of privacy. So you think about, the whole distribution model, sales distribution model for Amazon, their distribution partners, ultimately the customer, and then if we're an ISV and a support provider, licensing, trading licensing with support information. Today that's managed on kind of a consent and notice and a contractual perspective for every single party. Mm-hmm. Do you see the area of privacy also falling ultimately at some point under the preemption of local enforcement as well?
Okay. So, the question is, where's privacy heading given, again, this proliferation of jurisdictions that companies have to deal with? So I have, I have, I guess, what you might think of as a very radical, or maybe this is the libertarian half of the book, view of privacy, which is it doesn't exist. It's gone. Forget about it. Again, I have that visceral reaction every time something comes up that's new and I think, ah, my privacy, and then 5 minutes later I'm like, it's gone, it doesn't matter, it's hopeless, it's unenforceable. And that's the bottom line is, as I say, it really doesn't matter. So Europe has a completely different approach to privacy. It's much more restrictive in terms of what companies can do, whereas, of course, in the US, the real restrictions on privacy is what the government can or can't do. In Europe, it's more what corporations can or can't do. The net effect is zero, because it's unenforceable. And one way or the other, whether it's either literally unenforceable because the cost is prohibitive and they don't have the kind of resources to even investigate the complaints of millions of people saying, well, that data, flew there. But if it's not literally unenforceable, the market is going to overcome it anyway. Because the value in terms of efficiency, in terms of new products and services that we get from cloud computing or from social network, these new innovations, they do have a cost to our privacy. There's no question about it. But as long as the benefit is vastly greater than that cost, the market is going to insist on reality taking over whatever the law books say, whatever's written on them. So I think, here's what I think. I think over the next 10 years, there will be a lot more privacy law passed around the world, including in the US. Most of it will never be enforced, and what is enforced will never be effectively enforced. And after another 10 years, we'll give up. Maybe that's more like hope than what I guess. But that's certainly been what's happened in the last 10 years. So if that's any prediction, that's what's going to happen. Yeah?
The thumbs up on the Google Books.
Okay, so yeah, for a while there, I thought I was the only person on the planet who thought the Google Books deal was a good one. As many of you know, Google started this project several years ago of scanning library books, and they created this gigantic, vast database which you can search. And almost immediately, they got sued by the sort of leading trade associations of both authors and publishers. Long negotiation transpired, and ultimately they reached a settlement in this class action suit. And the judge asked for comments and objections to the proposed settlement, and was overwhelmed. So basically, hundreds of different groups with lots of different agendas, including the Department of Justice, the U.S. Registrar of Copyrights. Lots of non-U.S. people said this deal is terrible, because what it does is it says, okay. There's basically three kinds of books in the database, and as the database grows, those three kinds of books will continue to expand. But the three kinds of books are books that are still in print and that are being commercially sold, books that are out of print, for which we happen to know who owns the copyright, and then the third, which is the largest is books that are in print, but books that are out of print, but we don't know who owns the copyright. We call these orphan works. Sorry, there's a fourth group, which is books that are out of print and out of copyright. Well, for the out of copyright books, Google can do whatever they want. Nobody objects to that because they're out of copyright. That's it. That's the end of protection. Anybody can do what they want with books that are out of copyright. For the books that are still in print, there's also no problem. Google's already made separate deals with the publishers and the authors and said, it's really the publishers, by the way. The authors, I don't own the rights to that book anymore. I sold them all to the publisher, so I can whine about it all I want. They're the ones who actually have any legal rights. But for the in-print books, they made deals so that if you want to read it or buy it, there's a price and there's a relationship already established. Right? So those two are out of it. Where the settlement got messy was for the books that are out of print. And really, where it gets messy is the books that are out of print and for which we don't know who owns the copyright anymore. And the reason I said that the Google Books deal was a good deal was because the problem with copyright law is that particularly in the last 25 years, but really over the last 50 years, the entertainment industry has lobbied very effectively to get copyright protection stronger all the time. It lasts longer, the penalties get bigger all the time, the enforcement prices go up all the time. And so even as we have this sort of digital revolution where the cost of publishing, the cost of research, the cost of distribution, the cost of marketing all go down, right, because you can do a lot digitally that you used to have to do physically. So even as the cost goes down, they want more protection. And the only reason copyright protection exists in the first place is to give incentives to authors who might otherwise not, want to do production because they're not going to recover their costs. Well, if the cost goes down, you think they need less incentive. In fact, as the cost gone down, they've gotten more incentive. And one of the reasons is, and I think there's certain validity to it, is what the publishers say is, well, yes, it's gotten much cheaper to produce. It's also gotten much cheaper to steal. And it's also gotten much harder to find and stop the people from stealing because they can hide in sort of digital life. And that's why, so that's their basis for it. But they've gone to a point now where, these days, if you write a book, from the minute you've written it, you have exclusive ownership under copyright for your life plus another 75 years. Now, the reality is that 99% of all books go out of print within 2 years. And their likelihood of ever coming back in print is extremely small. So if you think this, so let's take my book and say 100 years from now, it's still under copyright. Well, my publisher is long gone and doesn't care because the book is out of print and it's been out of print for decades. I didn't leave the rights to anybody in my will because it was a valueless asset. And so there was no point. Or I've been dead for so long that, if I did leave those rights, they've been split up and split up and split up to the point where nobody really knows who owns it. And so of the books that Google has scanned, I think about 7 million of them are these so-called orphan works, where the copyright is so overprotective that even though the assets cease to have any value, nobody can do anything with it anymore. Right? So if somebody, if there's a researcher who wants that book or who wants to copy it or wants to even bring it back into print, there's no way to determine who owns the rights. So what the settlement did was it said, okay, we're going to solve, and Congress has said for the last 15 years, oh, we're going to pass a bill to solve the orphan works problem. Well, of course they can't because the entertainment lobby won't let them. So what the settlement did was it was a very clever end run. It said, well, for those orphan works, unless the owner of the copyright objects, which of course they can't because we don't know who they are, so unless the owner objects, those books are going to be online and we will make them available and we will collect fees if people want to copy them or whatever, on our standard scale, and we will give that money, or the author's share of that money, to this registry that we're going to create, this not-for-profit group, and their job will be basically to try and find who gets this money. Who are the owners or the rightful heirs of these orphan works. So the good news is it brings 7 million books essentially back into availability that otherwise would stay unavailable for no good reason for maybe another 50, 60 years. And I thought that was, really clever. Obviously, the real solution is not to have given such extensive copyright protection in the first place, but too late for that. This solved the problem very nicely. And anyway, as you know, the objectors were very strong about this. In particular, the Department of Justice that said, well, this is really rewriting copyright law. Yeah, that's right. It is. Good for them. But the parties got the message, and now they're back. So they've promised to come back with a new draft, I think in early November, to try and respond to some of the objections. So we'll see if it goes forward. But the bottom line was, it was a way of getting back into production or back into availability a lot of really interesting stuff that simply is in this limbo land and is going to stay there as long as we have overprotection of copyright law. So that's why I thought it was a good deal, but I was the only one.
Maybe one more question.
Okay. Yeah.
In response to one of the earlier questions, you said that you are looking at this issue in the scope of US and primarily European Union.
Yeah.
And you said that you feel uncomfortable for the other countries' point of view, while there are very interesting things going on in other countries, like, for example, Turkey banning access to the YouTube for the entire country. So why do you say that? I was wondering why you are saying you feel uncomfortable for...
Oh, so literally, my comfort is that, I have expertise in U.S. law. I'm a U.S. lawyer. I have studied well enough European law to feel comfortable talking about it, but my knowledge of Asian law, my knowledge of Middle Eastern law, African law is pretty much zero, and so I don't feel competent to talk about it.
There are significant gaps between how these countries are looking to the problem versus the other countries.
Yeah, and I do talk a little about the YouTube problem, particularly, obviously from a U.S. standpoint, we think, oh well, it's the First Amendment, we know rights to free speech. But as John Perry Barlow famously said many, many years ago, in cyberspace, the First Amendment is a local ordinance. It does not apply outside the U.S. And in fact, in many regions, let alone many nations of the world, this idea of completely free access to say what you want or think what you want or comment on what you want is not part of a long-standing tradition and may not be ever, or certainly not in the near future. So definitely when it comes to content, particularly obviously controversial content, either politically or culturally or socially controversial content, we've by no means established ground rules for a global basis for thinking about that. Okay, thanks for that.